Jackson Merritt was no ordinary man, though he often claimed otherwise. He lived on the outer rim planet of Thornax Prime, a temperate world colonized centuries ago by humans. While most settlers focused on farming or mining Thornax's rich cobalt reserves, Jackson had carved out a curious niche as the galaxy's foremost collector of peculiar and exotic pets. His sprawling habitat dome, known locally as the menagerie, was the stuff of legend. Inside, creatures from dozens of worlds coexisted in bewildering harmony or chaos, depending on the day. From the moment visitors stepped inside, they were greeted by a cacophony of chirps, roars, clicks, and whirs. Among the crowd favorites were Banjo, the melodious Gorkian squallhopper, who could mimic any tune, and Pebbles, a lumbering 6-ton Varaxian Mossbeast, whose hobby was knitting absurdly large scarves from fibrous vines. Jackson had an uncanny ability to tame creatures that defied logic or explanation. To him, they weren't just animals, they were family. Jackson himself was an unassuming figure. He was tall, lanky, with sandy brown hair that refused to behave. His perpetual grin and easygoing manner belied the fact that his collection of animals had earned him both fame and infamy across multiple star systems. Some called him a genius, others an eccentric lunatic. He didn't care what anyone thought. His life was good, and his pets made it better. That all changed the day the Varaxian Empire invaded. The Varaxians were a notoriously ruthless race of biomechanical conquerors. Their arrival in Thornaxian space was heralded by an enormous fleet of spiked warships blotting out the planet's twin suns. From orbit, the Varaxians issued their demands: immediate surrender of all resources, technology, and labor forces, or annihilation. The local militia was no match for such overwhelming power. Panic swept through Thornax Prime like wildfire. Jackson, however, had other concerns. It began with Waffles, his pet skitter frog. Waffles was a squat, amphibious creature with bright green skin and a knack for opening jars. Normally, Waffles lived in a comfortable terrarium near Jackson's kitchen, content to nibble on glowberries and hop around aimlessly. But on the morning of the invasion, Waffles became agitated. The little frog chirped incessantly, his bulbous eyes darting toward the sky. "What's got you so worked up?" Jackson asked, leaning down to peer at the tiny creature. Waffles emitted a low, guttural trill that made the hairs on Jackson's neck stand up. It was the kind of sound that hinted at impending doom. Moments later, the ground shook. Jackson staggered to the nearest window and saw plumes of black smoke rising from the nearby town of Cragspire. His comm unit buzzed frantically with warnings of the Varaxian assault, yet as fear began to bubble in his chest, a different sound caught his attention. It was coming from deeper inside the menagerie, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Curious and slightly alarmed, Jackson followed the noise to the central habitat chamber. What he found there left him speechless. The source of the hum was Puffball, a sentient gaseous lifeform from the Nebulon belt. Normally a placid and unremarkable being, Puffball now glowed with an intensity Jackson had never seen before. Tendrils of light extended from its amorphous form, connecting with the other creatures in the chamber. Pebbles let out a low, rumbling growl, while Banjo whistled a sharp, staccato tune. Even Waffles, who had somehow escaped his terrarium, joined the chorus with a series of rapid clicks. "Okay," Jackson muttered, rubbing his temples. "This is officially weird." Before he could process what was happening, the hum coalesced into a single, thunderous pulse that rippled outward like a shockwave. Every creature in the menagerie froze, their eyes or equivalent sensory organs fixing on Jackson. Then, as one, they began to move. What followed was equal parts chaos and revelation. The creatures, each seemingly acting on some unspoken command, began to prepare. Pebbles uprooted a section of the chamber floor, revealing a hidden cache of crystalline spheres Jackson didn't even know existed. Banjo used its prehensile tail to arrange the spheres into a precise formation. Puffball emitted a low-frequency vibration that caused the spheres to resonate, filling the air with a faint hum. Waffles hopped onto Jackson's shoulder and croaked impatiently. "Wait, you expect me to help?" Jackson asked incredulously. "I don't even know what's going on." The croak turned into a sharp bark, as if to say, "Get it together, human." Reluctantly, Jackson joined in. Under Waffles' supervision, he began rearranging equipment, connecting power conduits, and activating dormant systems within the dome. The process felt less like work and more like a bizarre, interspecies dance. Every time he hesitated, one of the creatures would nudge him in the right direction. Hours later, Jackson stood back to survey the result. The menagerie's central chamber had been transformed into something resembling a control room. A network of glowing crystals formed an intricate lattice overhead, pulsating with energy. The creatures had assembled what looked like a makeshift communication array, complete with a targeting system and a defense grid. "Are you guys building a weapon?" Jackson asked, half joking. Puffball shimmered in response. Jackson got the distinct impression it was saying, "You'll see." The Varaxians were not idle during this time. Their forces advanced rapidly, overwhelming Thornaxian defenses and establishing outposts across the planet. Their leader, a towering insectoid being named Xelzor, issued a final ultimatum: surrender within 24 hours or face planetary extinction. Jackson didn't have 24 hours. By nightfall, a Varaxian patrol unit arrived at his dome. The sight of the spindly, spider-like machine stalking toward the menagerie sent a jolt of fear through him. But his pets remained calm. Waffles croaked confidently, Banjo let out a jaunty trill, and Pebbles lumbered into position near the entrance. The Varaxians breached the dome. Their leader, a coldly efficient drone named Crixon, surveyed the scene with contempt. "This structure is of no strategic value," Crixon declared in a metallic rasp. "Surrender and vacate immediately or face extermination." Jackson opened his mouth to respond, but Waffles beat him to it. The skitterfrog launched itself at Crixon with surprising speed, emitting a piercing screech mid-leap. The sound wave disrupted the Varaxians' comm systems, causing the drone to falter. That was the cue. Banjo activated the defense grid, sending arcs of energy cascading through the dome. Pebbles barreled forward, using its massive bulk to scatter the Varaxian patrol units like toy soldiers. Puffball emitted a concentrated pulse of energy that scrambled the invaders' targeting systems. Jackson could only watch in stunned amazement as his pets executed their counterattack with surgical precision. In less than 10 minutes, the Varaxians were forced to retreat, their once formidable patrol unit reduced to smoldering wreckage. As the dust settled, Waffles hopped onto Jackson's shoulder and let out a triumphant croak. "You're telling me this was your plan all along?" Jackson asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Waffles blinked slowly, as if to say, "Obviously." For the first time, Jackson realized his pets weren't just unusual, they were extraordinary. And they weren't done yet. Word of Jackson's improbable victory spread quickly across Thornax Prime. The idea of a single man and his ragtag collection of pets defeating a Varaxian patrol unit seemed too absurd to be true. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Smoldering Varaxian wreckage littered the perimeter of the menagerie, and the unmistakable scorch marks of a defensive grid now adorned its dome. Local resistance leaders, desperate for any shred of hope, flocked to Jackson's dome. They wanted answers, strategies, anything that could turn the tide against the invaders. Jackson, still reeling from the events, wasn't sure how to respond. "I don't know how it happened," he told a skeptical militia captain named Elric Venn. "One moment I'm feeding Waffles, and the next he's leading a coordinated defense against advanced alien technology." "You're saying the frog is a tactical genius?" Elric asked, raising an eyebrow. "No," Jackson replied, glancing at Waffles, who was now happily chewing on a glowberry. "I'm saying they're all tactical geniuses. Somehow." The creatures, gathered around Jackson, seemed to puff up with pride at the acknowledgement. Puffball shimmered faintly, Banjo hummed a jaunty tune, and Pebbles gave an approving grunt. "I don't trust this," Elric muttered, eyeing the creatures warily. "But we're out of options." With no time to waste, the resistance began coordinating with Jackson and his pets. The Varaxians, overconfident in their superiority, had spread their forces thin across the planet. This left key installations vulnerable to precise strategic strikes. What the resistance lacked in firepower, the menagerie made up for in sheer unpredictability. The first target was a Varaxian energy siphon located in the dense jungles of Thornax's equatorial zone. The siphon was draining the planet's geothermal reserves to fuel the Varaxian fleet. Disabling it would cripple the invaders' operations. Jackson and his pets led the charge, supported by a small team of resistance fighters. The jungle presented a host of challenges, from thick foliage to hostile native wildlife, but the creatures of the menagerie adapted effortlessly. Banjo scouted ahead, its melodic calls mimicking the sounds of jungle predators to keep Varaxian patrols off balance. Waffles, using his unparalleled jar-opening skills, managed to bypass a series of energy locks on the siphon's control panels. Pebbles served as a living battering ram, smashing through barriers and clearing paths with ease. The true wildcard, however, was Puffball. The sentient gas cloud proved to be a master of electronic interference. By emitting precise vibrations, it scrambled the Varaxian drones' command signals, turning their own machines against them. Within hours, the energy siphon was inoperable, and the team retreated with minimal casualties. The Varaxians were furious, but their response was sluggish and disorganized. They had never encountered resistance like this before, and they had certainly never faced an enemy that included a knitting Mossbeast and a hyper-intelligent frog. While the resistance celebrated their victory, the Varaxians regrouped. Zelzer, the supreme commander of the invasion force, analyzed the reports with growing frustration. A human civilian and a collection of biological anomalies have disrupted 3 of our installations, Zelzer growled, his mandibles clicking in irritation. Explain. Crixon, the drone leader who had survived the initial encounter with the Menagiri, hesitated. The human's creatures exhibit unique properties that defy standard classifications. They are unpredictable and... Enough excuses, Zelzer snapped. Deploy the Decimator. The Decimator was the Varaxians' ultimate weapon, a towering, heavily armed mech designed to annihilate anything in its path. Zelzer was confident that no primitive resistance or bizarre pet collection could stand against it. The Decimator arrived at Crag Spire, a fortified resistance stronghold with devastating efficiency. Its arrival was marked by a series of thunderous explosions that reduced the outer defenses to rubble. Resistance fighters scrambled to hold the line, but their weapons barely scratched the mech's reinforced armor. Jackson and his pets were called in as a last resort. As they approached the battlefield, the sight of the towering Decimator made even Pebbles hesitate. Jackson swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. "This is crazy," he muttered. "We're just a guy and some animals. What can we possibly do against that?" Waffles croaked sharply, his tone laced with determination. Puffball shimmered, and Banjo whistled an upbeat tune. Even Pebbles let out a low, rumbling growl that sounded oddly like encouragement. "Okay," Jackson said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." The battle unfolded in a chaotic blur. The Decimator's heavy plasma cannons tore through resistance forces, but the Menagiri was unlike anything the Varaxians had faced. Pebbles charged headfirst into the fray, using its immense bulk to shield the resistance fighters from incoming fire. The mecha's weaponry was powerful, but it couldn't penetrate the Mossbeast's dense, fibrous hide. Puffball floated above the battlefield, emitting interference pulses that disrupted the Decimator's targeting systems. Waffles, true to form, proved to be the most unexpected hero. The tiny frog leapt onto the Decimator's hull, evading automated defenses with astonishing agility. Using his uncanny knack for opening things, Waffles pried open a maintenance hatch and began sabotaging the mech's internal systems. Meanwhile, Banjo played a critical role in rallying the resistance. Its melodic calls boosted morale and coordinated the fighters' movements, creating a level of cohesion that the Varaxians couldn't match. As the Decimator faltered under the relentless assault, Jackson seized the opportunity. With a makeshift rocket launcher provided by the resistance, he delivered a critical shot to the mecha's exposed power core. The resulting explosion lit up the night sky, and the Decimator collapsed in a heap of smoldering debris. Cheers erupted from the resistance fighters, but Jackson's attention was on Waffles, who emerged from the wreckage with a triumphant croak. "You're incredible," Jackson said, scooping up the little frog. "All of you." The destruction of the Decimator marked a turning point in the conflict. The Varaxians, shaken by their inability to defeat a human civilian and his pets, began to withdraw from Thornax Prime. Zelzer, humiliated and furious, ordered a full retreat, vowing revenge. For the people of Thornax Prime, the victory was nothing short of miraculous. Jackson and the Menagiri were hailed as heroes, their exploits immortalized in song and story. As for Jackson, he couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. He was just a guy who loved animals, yet somehow his pets had saved an entire planet. "Looks like you're all stuck with me now," he told his creatures as they settled back into the menagerie. Waffles croaked, Banjo hummed, Pebbles rumbled, and Puffball shimmered. It was their way of saying, "We wouldn't have it any other way." The victory over the Varaxians had turned Jackson Merritt and his menagerie into legends. News of their triumph spread beyond Thornax Prime, reaching neighboring systems where whispers of resistance against the Varaxian Empire began to stir. Thornaxians, once resigned to defeat, now brimmed with hope, and Jackson's dome became a hub for planning and strategizing future campaigns. Jackson, however, found himself struggling to adjust to his newfound fame. He was a man who preferred quiet days tending to his creatures, not the constant buzz of meetings, tactical briefings, and demands for his time. Resistance leaders poured into the menagerie daily, each one eager to unlock the secrets of his extraordinary pets. "They're not weapons," Jackson told a group of eager tacticians as Waffles perched on his shoulder. "They're my family. And they act on their own. I'm not controlling them." "You're saying they decide their own tactics?" One of the leaders, a wiry strategist named Tarlin, asked skeptically. "That's impossible." "Tell that to Waffles," Jackson replied, gesturing to the frog, who was intently examining a holographic map of the Varaxian positions. Waffles let out a sharp croak and nudged Jackson's hand, pointing to a sector marked as heavily fortified. Tarlin frowned. "That's the Varaxian main outpost. It's impenetrable." Waffles croaked again, this time with a tone of impatience. Jackson shrugged. "He says otherwise." The Varaxian main outpost was indeed a fortress, constructed from black, spiked alloys and guarded by an army of drones and mechanized walkers. It was the nerve center of their operations on Thornax Prime. Resistance forces had attempted to infiltrate it before, only to suffer catastrophic losses. Jackson and his team, however, had no intention of attacking head-on. Following Waffles' lead, they devised a plan so unconventional that most of the resistance dismissed it outright. But Jackson had learned to trust his pets, no matter how bizarre their strategies seemed. The operation began under the cover of darkness. Banjo led the way, using its mimicry abilities to imitate the sounds of Varaxian machinery, confusing patrols and drawing drones away from key positions. Puffball floated high above the outpost, spreading a faint, shimmering haze that disrupted the Varaxian sensors. Pebbles carried a makeshift battering ram crafted from salvaged scrap metal on its back, ready to breach the outer walls. Jackson followed closely, armed with nothing more than a utility belt and a healthy dose of skepticism. Waffles rode on his shoulder, chirping instructions that Jackson relayed to the resistance fighters. Inside the fortress, chaos unfolded. Banjo's mimicry reached a fever pitch, creating the illusion of an internal mutiny among the Varaxian forces. Automated defenses turned on each other, firing at phantom threats conjured by Puffball's interference field. Pebbles used its immense strength to collapse entire corridors, cutting off reinforcements and isolating key command units. At the heart of the outpost, Waffles took center stage. The tiny frog leapt onto the central control console, his quick movements and precise clicks bypassing layers of Varaxian encryption. Jackson could only watch in amazement as Waffles accessed the system, shutting down the outpost's power grid and disabling its defenses. The Varaxians scrambled to regain control, but it was too late. Resistance fighters surged into the outpost, capturing it with minimal casualties. For the first time in the campaign, the Thornaxians held a decisive advantage. As the dust settled, Jackson leaned against a battered console, Waffles perched triumphantly on his shoulder. "You're unbelievable," Jackson said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't even know how you do it." Waffles blinked slowly, his expression as inscrutable as ever. The fall of the Varaxian main outpost sent shockwaves through the Empire. Zelzer, the Supreme Commander, could no longer ignore the threat posed by Jackson and his pets. Enraged by the repeated humiliations, he convened a council of his most ruthless war strategists. "This insolent human and his beasts have made a mockery of our forces," Zelzer growled, his mandibles twitching with fury. "They must be eliminated at all costs." The Varaxians devised a plan to strike directly at the menagerie, aiming to destroy Jackson's base of operations and capture his pets for study. They dispatched a massive assault force, including experimental war machines designed specifically to counter the abilities of the menagerie's creatures. The attack came at dawn. Jackson was jolted awake by the sound of alarms and the distant rumble of Varaxian engines. Racing to the central habitat, he found his creatures already mobilizing. Banjo's melodic calls echoed the dome, rallying the others. Puffball shimmered with an intensity that made the air hum with static energy. Pebbles stood at the dome's entrance, bracing for the oncoming assault. Jackson felt a surge of fear. The Varaxians had brought an overwhelming force, far greater than anything they'd faced before. But as he looked at his pets, their unwavering confidence filled him with determination. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "Let's show them what you're made of." The battle that followed was nothing short of extraordinary. The Varaxians unleashed their experimental war machines, each one tailored to neutralize a specific creature. Anti-sonic devices targeted Banjo's mimicry, energy dampeners sought to nullify Puffball's interference, and high-density kinetic weapons were designed to pierce Pebble's tough hide. But the Menagiri adapted. Banjo switched tactics, using its tail to manipulate physical objects and create barriers. Puffball emitted bursts of light that blinded and disoriented the enemy. Pebbles, with Jackson's guidance, utilized hit-and-run tactics, smashing key targets before retreating to safety. Waffles, as always, was the wild card. The tiny frog moved through the chaos with uncanny precision, sabotaging Varaxian equipment and creating openings for counterattacks. At one point, he managed to disable a massive siege walker by wedging himself into its control chamber and short-circuiting its systems. Despite the odds, the Menagiri held its ground. By the end of the day, the Varaxian assault force lay in ruins, their experimental weapons reduced to smoldering wreckage. The Thornaxians, inspired by the victory, launched a coordinated offensive that drove the Varaxians off the planet entirely. As the last of the Varaxian ships fled Thornaxian space, Jackson stood outside the battered dome of the menagerie. His creatures gathered around him. Waffles hopped onto his shoulder, letting out a triumphant croak. "You did it," Jackson said, his voice filled with gratitude and wonder. "All of you. We wouldn't have made it without you." Banjo hummed a celebratory tune, Puffball shimmered brightly, and Pebbles let out a deep, contented rumble. For a moment, the galaxy seemed to pause, the bonds between man and beast stronger than ever. Jackson knew the Varaxians would return one day, but for now Thornax Prime was free, and it was all thanks to a man and his extraordinary pets. The Varaxians may have been driven off Thornax Prime, but Jackson Merritt and his pets knew the war was far from over. The Menagiri had become the symbol of resistance, not only on Thornax but across neighboring systems, and with that fame came an overwhelming burden. Messages flooded in from desperate colonies begging for help against the Varaxian onslaught. The resistance had grown, bolstered by the incredible victories of Jackson and his creatures, but the Varaxian Empire still held vast resources and power. Their retreat from Thornax had been a temporary setback, and everyone knew they would return, more prepared and more ruthless than ever. Jackson stood in the central chamber of the Menagiri, watching as his creatures rested after the latest battle. Banjo was perched on a ledge, tuning its melodic calls into soft, soothing notes. Puffball drifted lazily overhead, its glow dim and peaceful. Pebbles sprawled across the floor, knitting yet another absurdly large scarf from salvaged fabric, while Waffles napped in the sunlight, his tiny chest rising and falling with each croaky breath. They had earned a moment of peace, but Jackson's mind wouldn't let him rest. The Varaxians had retreated, but their last attack had been devastating. The Menagiri itself had taken damage, with several habitats now unusable. Worse, reports suggested that Salzer, the Varaxian commander, was planning a full-scale invasion of the system, using Thornax as the staging ground for a renewed assault. The question wasn't if they would return, it was when. As Jackson brooded, a comm unit buzzed to life, and Captain Elric Ven's voice crackled through. "Jackson, we've intercepted a Varaxian transmission. It's worse than we thought. Zelzer's bringing the fleet core." Jackson frowned. "Fleet core? Sounds important." "It's their main war engine. If they deploy it here, Thornax won't just lose. They'll strip the planet to its core and move on to the next system. We have 2 days tops." Jackson ran a hand through his hair, glancing at his pets. "All right, let's hear it. What's the plan?" "We need to evacuate," Elric said. "We can't win this one." Jackson's jaw tightened. "Evacuate? We've got people on this planet who can't just pack up and leave. Besides, these guys don't exactly leave survivors. You really think the fleet core will stop if we run?" Silence followed on the other end of the comm. Jackson knew the answer. When Elric finally spoke, his tone was heavy. "Then I hope you've got one of your crazy ideas, Merritt, because we're out of time." Jackson turned back to his creatures. Banjo tilted its head, emitting a questioning trill. Waffles was already awake, fixing Jackson with an expectant stare. Puffball shimmered faintly, and even Pebbles paused its knitting, letting out a low rumble that felt like determination. "You're right," Jackson said. "We've pulled off the impossible before. Let's do it one more time." The Fleet Corps arrived 2 days later, just as predicted. Its scale was staggering, a massive city-sized ship bristling with weapons and surrounded by a protective swarm of drones. The Varaxians deployed ground forces immediately, securing key locations across Thornax in preparation for their final assault. Above the planet, the Fleet Corps loomed like a second moon, casting a shadow over everything below. Jackson and the Resistance had used every moment of those 2 days to prepare. The menagerie had been transformed into a command center, its damaged sections reinforced and repurposed into traps and defensive structures. The Resistance fighters were armed and ready, but the true heart of their defense lay with Jackson's creatures. As the Varaxian forces began their advance, Banjo took to the skies, its melodic calls weaving an intricate pattern that echoed across the battlefield. The sound was disorienting, confusing the Varaxian drones and causing them to fire wildly at phantom targets. Puffball drifted high above, releasing bursts of electromagnetic interference that disrupted communication and targeting systems. Pebbles held the line with unyielding strength, smashing through wave after wave of Varaxian walkers. The massive creature was a one-being wrecking crew, its thick hide impervious to most weaponry. Meanwhile, Waffles worked behind the scenes, infiltrating enemy positions and sabotaging key systems with precision that defied explanation. Jackson coordinated the chaos, relaying instructions from his perch inside the central habitat. He had long since stopped questioning the intelligence of his pets. They acted with a level of strategy and cooperation that no human could match. But even with their incredible efforts, the Fleet Corps remained a looming threat. Its sheer size and firepower were overwhelming, and it began to rain destruction on the surface with terrifying efficiency. Resistance forces faltered, their courage wavering in the face of such power. Jackson knew they needed to act fast. "Waffles," he said, glancing at the frog perched on his shoulder. "Got any ideas for taking down a planet-sized death machine?" Waffles blinked, then let out a soft croak. He hopped down, leading Jackson to a holographic display of the Fleet Corps. The tiny frog's movements were deliberate as he pointed to several critical points on the ship's exterior. "Of course you've got a plan," Jackson muttered. "You always do." The final assault was as audacious as it was desperate. Jackson and his pets boarded a stolen Varaxian shuttle, using Puffball's interference field to slip past the Fleet Corps' defenses. The massive ship was a labyrinth of corridors and machinery, but Waffles led the way, navigating its systems with uncanny precision. Banjo and Puffball worked together to create distractions, luring Varaxian forces away from key areas. Pebbles served as both shield and battering ram, clearing obstacles and protecting the team from harm. At the heart of the Fleet Corps, they found the main power reactor, a pulsating, crystalline structure that hummed with raw energy. Waffles immediately set to work, his tiny limbs moving faster than Jackson thought possible. "You've got this, buddy," Jackson whispered, watching as Waffles bypassed security protocols and destabilized the reactor. Alarms blared as the reactor began to overload. The team raced back to their shuttle, narrowly avoiding the collapsing corridors and exploding machinery. As they cleared the Fleet Corps, the massive ship detonated in a blinding burst of light, scattering Varaxian forces and sending shockwaves through their fleet. The remaining Varaxian ships retreated, their invasion in ruins. On the surface, cheers erupted as the Resistance realized they had won. Thornax Prime was safe, and the Varaxians had been dealt a crippling blow. Back at the menagerie, Jackson and his pets finally allowed themselves to relax. Banjo hummed a victory tune, Pebbles resumed its knitting, and Puffball shimmered with a soft golden glow. Waffles, as always, perched on Jackson's shoulder, letting out a satisfied croak. "You did it again," Jackson said, shaking his head in amazement. "You all did." The galaxy might never understand the bond between Jackson and his creatures, but for the people of Thornax Prime, they were nothing short of heroes. And for Jackson, the greatest gift was knowing that, no matter what challenges lay ahead, his extraordinary pets would always be by his side.